Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
All right, let's get started. Thanks everybody for coming to our colloquium today. I'm absolutely thrilled to have Butler, our very own Butler Lamson here to talk to us about the personal control of your data. Butler, as you all probably know, has been a seminal figure in computer science, designing many of the systems and security systems that we use today. And he's a member of lots of academies and so on and so forth. He told me you could go read his Wikipedia page if you want to hear about his awards. So I'll skip over that. He also is an amazing green thumb and grows the most beautiful dahlias I've ever seen. So thanks.
The dahlias are just starting to come into bloom. So this is work that I started 3 or 4 years ago when it seemed to me that there was starting to be a lot of discussion about the problems of all the personal data about every one of us that's floating around on the internet and the relatively undisciplined way in which it is handled. And my original goal, I put together a somewhat interdisciplinary group. This is most of the people in the group that I listed here, to think about this question. And the original goal was just to try to sketch out the landscape and figure out what sort of regulatory schemes could possibly be feasible. But of course, the project morphed into something else, and it ended up as an attempt to design, to recognize the fact that in different parts of the world, people's priorities are different, governments have different ideas, cultures have different ideas about what's important. And it's not realistic to believe that there's going to be a single regulatory regime for the use of personal data everywhere in the world. What does seem feasible is that you could have a single set of technical underpinnings that would be able to support a wide variety of different regulatory schemes. So that's what I'm going to tell you about today. So a little bit of background to get started. Why worry about this at all? We've had data for a long time. Well, what's so special about online data? Well, I think to boil it down a great deal, basically 2 things. Number one, the online data is very widespread, both in time and in space. It persists, stays around for a long time. It's easy to copy. Practically anyone can get their hands on it. And it's accessible because you can find it either by searching or by following links. And what that means is that privacy through obscurity doesn't work anymore. If the stuff is there at all, Google and Bing will index it and you'll be able to find it. And anonymity is hard. The other thing that's, I think, people haven't really begun to come to grips with yet, but that I think is going to be even more important than the concerns we have about data that starts out digitally, that starts out with someone typing it in, is the data about people in the physical world is going to be just as important. So random example, there are today in the United States several 100,000 cameras that routinely take pictures of license plates of cars that are going by. And then people do OCR on these pictures and compile databases of the form, a car with this license plate was seen at this particular time and place. And it should be obvious with just a tiny bit of thought that reveals a great deal of information about the people who might be driving the car. As face recognition improves and the array of sensors that are scattered around increases and so on and so forth, this problem of data from the physical world becoming digitized and becoming accessible in the same way that your Facebook pages and your browsing history and so forth are accessible is going to become much worse. If we're going to have regulation, it has to have, in order to have any chance of succeeding, it has to have some properties. It has to be feasible in at least 4 dimensions. It has to be technically feasible. It doesn't make any sense to make a set of rules that you technically can't find a way to enforce. It has to be legally feasible. The legal and regulatory system has to be able to enforce the rules, not perfectly, but well enough that they work for the most part. It has to be economically feasible. If it puts Google out of business, then it's not going to fly. because people are not going to put up with a system that has the property that search stops being free. And it has to be politically feasible. You have to be able to persuade politicians and to some extent the public that it's a reasonable scheme. This is, yeah. Oh yeah, I should have said, please don't hesitate to ask questions. This slide deck was made up for a somewhat shorter talk, so there should be plenty of time for questions.
Of the 4 types of feasibility on that bullet,
yes.
I'm trying to understand their meanings by placing the word infeasible after each one and see if I can understand what that means. What would it mean to be legally infeasible? Infeasible under current law or infeasible under any potential law that might be?
No, what I meant by that was it doesn't do any good to pass a law if you can't find any way to enforce it. And there's a variety of different ways in which laws can be impractical. And I was lumping all of the ones that aren't strictly technical under that rubric. This is not a problem that's going to have a purely technical solution. There is no purely technical way in which you can stop people from collecting data and from misusing it. So that means the technology and the rules have to work hand in hand. The goal of a technical scheme has to be to support the rules, but it can't determine what they are. And so as I said before, the goal that we ended up with in this project was to try to find a common technological base that could support a wide variety of different rules. A lot of reports have been written on this subject over the last 20 years, and one of the things we considered in this group was, gee, do we really need to have this? A lot of other people have worked on this problem. Reading these reports, I read quite a few of them. My conclusion was, for the most part, they have a strong motherhood character. Mothers and kids are good, apple pie is good, so on and so forth. And that's all very well and good, but it doesn't really help. So we spent a little bit of time trying to figure out what's the regulation really for in some meaningful way. And it seems like a couple things. One is, one of the reasons that we need regulation in this space is to maintain a balance of power among individuals, companies, and governments. Because fundamentally individuals are at a disadvantage in this context. And secondly, the second purpose of regulation is to serve the public good, to make sure that in addition to individual privacy, other things get safeguarded. The ability to have innovation, do research, do law enforcement, traffic control, just a whole range of things that data can be used for, which make it very hard to lay down some kind of ironclad principles and enforce them ruthlessly. It's important to recognize that existing law covers a lot of cases. Existing law has a lot to say about the use of data that's intellectual property, about fraud, about how public records are handled, and so on and so forth. And those things are not all going to be turned upside down by the fact that the data is digital. A third important consideration is that if you're going to have personal control of your data, that means you have to have some way to exercise that control. But people's ability to exercise and willingness to exercise control is pretty limited for the most part. And so the choices that you present to people have to be simple. And my simple-minded way of figuring out whether the choices are simple or not is to say it should fit on one screen in reasonable size type for normal purposes. And if you can't figure that out, then it's too complicated. Of course, for the geeks among us, the screen can have drill down, so you can click on various things and you get 1,000 screens. But you have to recognize that 99% of the people in the world are never going to do that. And so anything that doesn't fit on the one screen is not, basically serves only a PR purpose. A fourth thing to bear in mind about regulatory systems is that regulations change pretty slowly, and because we're not really that smart, it's very hard in many cases to figure out what all the consequences of regulations are going to be. So those are just all good things to bear in mind. You might also wonder, maybe it's really not necessary to think about this problem. The system we have now, where basically Google decides what's okay to do, is not so bad, and we could just live with it. I don't think that's really going to fly. There's strong reasons to believe that people really want a sense of personal control over their data. And some studies have been done that reveal that even when you talk to people about how much effort they would have to exert in order to exercise some of this personal control, and they recognize that they're not very likely to actually do it, they still want the option, and they feel fairly strongly about it. A second reason why I think just putting your head in the sand and saying this is not a problem we need to worry about is that in many parts of the world, especially in Europe, regulators take the view that control of data is a human right, and they don't really care whether it's economically costly or not. It's not evaluated in that way, and we can see that, for example, in the recent European right to be forgotten regulations, which have imposed significant costs, at least on Google. And my personal opinion is that those rules are kind of stupid, but there's no question about why it is that they're there. They're there because the European court system thinks that people have a right to exercise this amount of control. Not for any, nobody did any calculation of what the cost of this regulation would be in order to enforce it. And we see this kind of thing in the US to a limited extent. For example, it's now the case almost uniformly in the US that if some of your personally identifiable information is exposed in a data breach, the organization that held that information has to notify you. And that actually started out in California. You never could get something like that through the current US Congress, but you could get it through the California legislature, and as a consequence of that, many other states have signed on to the same propositions. So and again, they didn't really evaluate whether they should do this or not based on any sort of economic calculation. In addition to that, it's actually the case that many firms would like to have a set of consistent and accepted rules, partly because they feel that this will make their customers feel better about them, and partly because they're worried about a haphazard regulatory scheme that will cause them much more trouble than a single unified scheme that, where there's a wide perception that the scheme is fair. This sketch is, I'm not going to dwell on this. I spent quite a bit of time drawing this picture, trying to figure out who wins and who loses in this regulatory battle. So here we have firms, people, and government as the major players, and I've kind of sketched out different motivations that people have. And it seems to me that fundamentally, the purpose of regulation is to serve people's need for personal control of the data. And basically, it costs everybody else. Nobody else would want a regulatory system of the kind that I'm sketching out. So now, to get a little bit more concrete, here's an ideal scheme for personal control of your data. You keep all your data in a vault. No one else is allowed to have any of it. All of your data is in a vault that you control. If I need access to your data, then I bring you a query, and you examine the query and decide whether you're willing to answer it or not. And if you are, then you go to your vault and give it the query, and the vault calculates the answer, and I give it back to you. You give it back to me. Otherwise, you tell me to go away. This is not a very practical scheme for a variety of reasons. It's too expensive, it's too slow, it doesn't answer any questions about, once I have this piece of data, the answer to my query, what am I allowed to do with it? And to first approximation, it prevents aggregation of data for research or other uses that would contribute to the public good. So this is not very practical. But nonetheless, it's good to bear in mind as sort of an ideal. So here's a set of goals that I think are practical for personal control of data. The notion is you're entitled to know where your data, who's got some of your data, and to be able to ask someone who has some of your data, what have they got? You're entitled to limit the use of the data to the extent that there aren't laws that say that you can't. Just random example, and there are lots and lots of such laws in customs. Random example, you might think that the price you paid for your house is personal data that shouldn't be public. But in fact, it's been established in American law, and I think probably everywhere else too, for many centuries, that that's a matter of public record. So you wouldn't be allowed to say that people can't have access to that data. You can exercise this authority anytime, not only when the data is collected. The current, quote, state-of-the-art, unquote, in data regulation is so-called notice and consent, which was put in about 20 years ago. And the idea of notice and consent is someone who wants to collect your data is supposed to have a 30-page privacy policy, and before they collect any data from you, they're supposed to present you with a checkbox that you check that says it's okay to do this in accordance with the privacy policy, which you can read by clicking on this link. And after that, it's open season. And we now have a lot of empirical evidence that says that this doesn't work at all. Yes?
There's a very nice book by Omri Ben Shahar called More Than You Wanted to Know, which is about why those things are both ineffectual as policy and invalid as law. He's a law professor at Chicago, and this might be a good thing to say.
Oh, they're invalid as law.
Yeah, so there's a whole...
I thought there was a bunch of law that said you had to have these things.
Well, it's changing. Yeah, it's not clear
Yeah.
at all that that's the case. Yeah.
Definitely, people have pretty much accepted that this scheme doesn't work. But also, just from a psychological point of view, aside from the fact that no one's going to read the 30 pages and that's not a very good time to ask the question and so on and so forth, often you change your mind about whether people should be allowed to do things with your data. And you don't really have control if you can't implement that change in your mind. It should work everywhere across the whole internet. I'll have a little bit more to say about exactly what that means. It should work consistently for all data handlers and devices. You shouldn't have a different scheme for what happens on your PC, what happens on your phone, what happens on your Amazon Echo, and so on and so forth. There should be a simple way of expressing your policy, and an unavoidable consequence of the fact that it has to be simple is that it's going to be very coarse. It's not going to be very practical. Maybe it'll be technically practical, but in real life, it's not going to be very practical to express a lot of fine nuances about how the data ought to be used. And of course, most people are never going to change the defaults, so it's important to have good defaults. And finally, a scheme for exercising personal control over your data is unavoidably going to have the property that there's going to be some connections between the data that's stored and the policy that you express. And we don't want that to turn into another anonymity breaking scheme. So there has to be provision for exercising anonymity.
So,
yes?
So is I'm just to understand, like, is your name supposed to be, is that a piece of personal data or not really?
The fact that this license plate is associated with this name might be a piece of personal data.
But
your name is pretty public.
Yeah, similarly, I was curious if you have a more precise definition of what constitutes your data or data about you.
We'll get to that.
Okay.
To some extent.
I thought maybe.
But to first approximation, the answer is going to be no. But my view is that that's a matter for the legal system to decide, not for the technical underpinnings. Okay. Oops. Did I go too fast? No. Here we go. So how's this going to actually work? Now we're getting down to the nitty-gritty. The basic idea is that any piece of personal data is going to carry with it a tag that links to the policy that controls use of that data. And the legal requirement is going to be that the data handler has to obey the policy whenever it uses that data, subject to whatever exceptions might be enacted by the regulatory system. The policy's got to be simple and coarse-grained, yada yada. Yes?
Is the data handler a human being, or is it another program that's processing information? In other words, is this tag being read automatically, and therefore the data can't be inserted into this function?
Since this is a rule, the rule has to have something that it can apply to, and that something is going to be either an individual or more likely an organization, which is going to be holding the data. Did that answer your question?
Well, I guess what I'm
I think
wondering
not.
is, like, okay, say I have a piece of personal information and I've tagged it saying this can't be used for these purposes, but it can be used for those purposes. If an individual then wants to use it for the purposes that I say it can't be used for, is it technologically impossible to then use it for those purposes? That you're relying on the person
there
saying,
isn't.
okay, they don't want it used for this.
In my opinion, there is no way, there's no technological way to enforce these rules.
Right.
Okay.
Yes.
So this is more Creative Commons than DRM.
Well, it's not Creative Commons in this. To the
It's like
extent that
marketing
Creative Commons is supported by the legal system, yes, it's like Creative Commons. To the extent that Creative Commons is just an expression of intent that's not actually enforceable, no, it's not like Creative Commons.
But you're
Did
not
that answer
imagining-
your question?
Yeah, and I think the question is, you're not imagining a sort of rights management mechanism that's supposed to
No,
recognize an act.
technically, no, absolutely not, because it'd be just, that's completely hopeless from many points of view.
That's true.
I mean, you can't even make it work for movies, for Christ's sake. How can you possibly think that you can make it work for... If nothing else, there's no way to prevent the data handler from separating the data. There's no technical way to prevent the data handler from separating the data from the tag. We just don't know how to implement anything like that. You know, why doesn't it work for movies? Because you can look at the screen with a camera and make a copy. It's just crazy. When I started working for Microsoft 20 years ago, I worked on anti-piracy for 2 or 3 years because it was a hot topic at the time. And I finally gave up for not for technical reasons, but basically because it turned out at that time, and to some extent this is still true, but it was definitely true in the late 90s, you just could not communicate with the content holders. Their model of how things ought to work was so at variance with reality that it was just impossible to make any headway. And the movie industry, the music industry, in fact, drove itself into the ground because of this. But there was nothing you could do. I mean, they were so pig-headed. Microsoft tried really hard to get people to behave, to recognize the facts of life, and it was a complete failure.
Yeah. I'm curious how the tags work when the data is originally generated offline.
We'll get there.
Okay.
This is only the very beginning.
And I thought, I don't know, I thought Nancy was going to ask, is there a difference between the rules? No.
You can ask for yourself.
That's a good question.
But you're not so sure, so you want to blame it on her. Please go ahead, Adam.
Just ask the question. So could the rules be distinguished? You know, they could be like a person cannot look at my photos, but a computer could. Is that they could be rules about what humans could do versus machines?
We'll get to that.
Okay.
How did I know you were going to do that?
In principle, I could imagine that, but in practice, I think that would be too complicated. We don't want this technical scheme to mandate the construction of some giant Big Brother database that keeps track of all this stuff. So an important property you want the thing to have is that responsibility for your side of it from the technical point of view is vested in agents that you control, you choose and that you control, not in some centralized mumble. And there's going to be, as we'll see, there's going to be 2 kinds of those agents. So there's 2 kinds of players. There's agents that you choose and that you control whose job it is basically to make your policy known to the data handlers. And then there's the data handlers themselves, who are the agents that are holding the data and that are subject to regulation. And in principle, anyone who stores or processes your data and is following the rules is one of these data handlers. You have to recognize, I'll have a little bit more to say about this later, but people that are not there's no technical way to force people to follow the rules. So people who can't be tracked down by the legal system or the regulatory system are not going to be able, this isn't going to do anything for them. If Adam gets hold of some compromising photo of mine and shares it with his friends, there's nothing much I can do about that. And this system is not going to help with that. But it is going to help with Facebook indexing it, because Facebook is going to be subject to the rules. And finally, because of the fact that people are going to have multiple identities, both for reasons of anonymity and because people have different ways of presenting themselves to the world, there's going to have to be a scheme by which an individual can have multiple personas, and the whole structure is going to have to support that. So some simple-minded examples. The second one here is the most of what you might use this for. The second one is the one that I've found was most interesting. The school often wants the ability to contact a parent in an emergency. To figure out which is the parent that's going to be most able to respond to the most able to respond promptly to the emergency situation, is in general going to require access to all kinds of information about where the parent is and what they're doing, which you don't want to broadcast to the world. How can you deal with that? I think the right way to think about it is for a complicated scenario like that, what you want to do is you want to have an application which is certified in some way, which has the property that it has access to, can get access to a lot of detailed information about where the parents are and what they're doing, and all it's going to do with this information is figure out which is the right parent to access and give the school that parent's phone number. Another example that's interesting, a traffic camera, I mentioned this before, a traffic camera records your license plate, and then the photo of the license plate by itself, of course, can't come under this rubric because you haven't yet connected it up with any individual. But as soon as you do that, as soon as you consult some DMV database that connects license plates with individuals, at that point the data should get tagged and should become subject to your policies for it. So a little bit more detail about how this is going to work. The data handler, as I said, the data handler is going to keep a tag with the data. The tag, what does the tag give in it? Basically two things. It's got an anonymous ID, which you can think of as a public key, plus it's got a link to a place where the handler can find out what your policy is. And the rule is that there are two rules. The handler must tag personal data. If the handler comes into possession of some personal data, which should come with a tag, then it has two choices. It either throws it away or it has to keep the data and the tag with it. So the way to think about this is, in principle, the tag comes along with your data from your agent. You know, when you type something in, your browser attaches that tag to it. The tag, if the data is copied, the tag gets copied with it. If the data is input to some computation, then the tag gets copied onto the results of that computation also, unless there's some good reason to believe that there's been enough aggregation done that the personal connection between you and the output of the computation is no longer important. And most important, the tag gets added to re-identified data, and especially for physical world data, that's the case. As soon as you establish a connection between the physical world data and some person, then it gets tagged as part of that connection. And the basic rule, the handler has to follow two rules. Number one, hang on to the tags. And number two, check the policy before using the data. And as I mentioned before, of course, this is only going to work for handlers that are subject to regulation. So at first you might say, well, that doesn't really solve the problem. But in fact, I think it does solve 98% of the problem. Because if you think about the way in which data becomes widespread and easily accessible, it's because there are organizations that are collecting substantial amounts of it and indexing it and so on and so forth. And those organizations, more or less necessarily, for the most part, are going to be subject to regulation. Yes?
Speaking to the economic feasibility, is there any way to relax the tag is copied when the data is copied? Because that seems to lead to a lot of duplication that maybe could be eliminated. So like, if data comes into Microsoft as a whole, and then each of us as researchers uses that data and puts it on our computer, we really have to take the tag with us to each of our own desktops.
Well, there's an extensive literature on data compression that might be able to answer that question. And I think that's the right way to think about it. Okay. In principle, yes. But how many bits is that actually going to cost? Well, that's a subject of it. Ingenious people can find ways to make that cheap. Bobby.
I'm worried that the term re-identified creates an enormous backdoor loophole for unscrupulous data handlers that sort of deliberately build up a shadow persona of you without re-identifying it. Like your license plate photo has been taken in 50 different cities over a span of 2 years.
Right.
And the data handler knows that there's a unique person, and that anytime they want, in less than a second, they could connect it with the name of that person. But they're not going to do that operation.
Yeah.
Because they actually want to maintain the technical appearance of anonymity, so that they can do deep mining on this copy of your persona.
Yeah.
Is that an intended behavior under this scheme? Or?
That's a challenge to write a law that would make that illegal.
Okay.
That's not a problem that we can solve technically. Whether you can write a good law for that is a fascinating question that I will not try to answer.
I mean, about what Elliot was asking about why you want to propagate those, just understand, like, if this was done with all images, and then I was doing an image search and I wanted to know if the images were subject to copyright or not, it would be nice because I would be able to, unless some evil party manipulated them, and if everyone was behaving according to the rules, I would know which images were good, and but that's why you need to do that, I guess.
And you wouldn't worry about the space in that case because the tag is tiny compared to the image. If the data is 1 bit and the tag is 1,000 bits, you might worry. Other questions?
How is this unless decided?
Unless. That's entirely up for grabs. I could have said, well, you have to prove a differential privacy theorem that it's okay. That doesn't seem realistic. What is going to be realistic? I don't know. We'll have to work on that.
So is a tag unique to each person, or are there like 10 different policies in the world and you get to choose one? And it's
We'll get to that. Okay, so that's the basic idea. A few more details. What exactly is a tag? A tag is a thing I'm calling a numeric ID, which you should think of as a public key, together with the URL for the policy service. And the notion is that, to first approximation, the numeric ID is anonymized. Maybe a single personal agent can arrange for that person to have lots of different numeric IDs, so that you can't just do the kind of thing that Bobby was talking about with the license plate with all the tagged data. Of course, if you sign in, then that becomes somewhat pointless, and presumably there'll be fewer of these numeric IDs if the data is actually coming from your Facebook account. The way the handler finds out what your policy is it follows the URL, and the URL leads it to the policy service, and the policy service will answer the question, what is the current policy for this data? In addition to that, the policy service, because the handlers have to query the policy service can track the handlers. And that means that you can go to your policy service and find out who are all the people that have your data. So let's look at a couple pictures. So in this scenario, here's your side and here's the handler's side. On your side, you have control. You get to choose the agent and the policy service. The reason there are two different things is that the policy service has to be online so that it can answer the handler's questions anytime. Whereas you might not want your agent to be online. You might want your agent to be on your phone or whatever. On the other side, we have the handlers. The regulators are making the rules about what the handlers have to do. So how does it go? First thing you do is you set your policy. Your agent tells your policy service what your policy is. And the policy consists of approximately of a whole bunch of statements of the form. This data type and this data handler is or is not allowed access to the data. The next thing that happens is you provide some data to somebody, to some handler. And the notion is that as you provide the data, you also send along the tag. That's this NID plus thing. And the handler stores the data along with what kind of data it is, which it figures out somehow, and the tag. Then if the handler wants to use the data for anything, it has to find out what the policy is. And it has to have some reasonably up-to-date notion of what the policy is. It doesn't, and how up-to-date is reasonable is another question that the technical scheme doesn't answer. It seems unreasonable to say that it has to be up to the millisecond. Maybe it has to be up to, you have to check again once a week or once a day or whatever. So how does that work? The handler says, here I am, I'm this handler, and here's the tag, and here's the type of data that I'm holding. And the policy service says, yes or no. And finally, if I want to claim my data back from the handler, I know by a process, the details of which we're going to get to in a couple slides, who the handler is. So I go to the handler and I say, here's my identity, give me back my data. Okay? Questions about that? Yes?
So I have a question. Just imagining that this policy was in place tomorrow, and this goes to, I think, the question of your example of the school policy, right? If you're giving up more data because you have the appearance of more control over your data, do you run the risk of actually creating a more valuable target and greater reason to try to identify somebody's NID, because there's the appearance, at least, that you actually have more control over your information?
In most cases, I think that's a pretty academic question, because you don't have much control over how much data you're giving up anyway.
Right.
Let's put that off for later.
Okay.
That's, yeah. I think I should press on a little bit, because otherwise I'm not going to get to the exciting stuff at the end. Okay, so this should be kind of obvious, but just to go through it, a scenario that is often discussed when people work on this problem is the fact that very frequently data is collected by one handler and then passed on to some other handler, either for commercial reasons or for some other reason. So, random, only semi-commercial example, doctor collects your data and it gets passed on to the hospital, or it gets passed on to the insurance company, or to CMS or whatever. So how does that go? Well, it starts out the same. You set the policy, you provide the data, then handler 1 wants to pass it on, transfer it to handler 2. So what that means is that the data goes from handler 1 to handler 2, and along with it comes the tag. And then when handler 2 wants to use the data, it has to do exactly the same thing that handler 1 was doing in the previous picture. Okay, so the essential thing is that the tag goes with the data. It's not associated with the handler or a device or anything like that. What about anonymity? The notion is the NIDs are public keys. Different relationships to your data call for different kinds of NIDs. You might want to be anonymous, to have a different identity for every session. You might be known because you've logged on to some website. Well, sorry. Right, you might be known in a sort of weak sense of you're using some website which has deposited a cookie so that they can keep track of you, of your preferences and so forth. But you haven't actually, you don't have an account with that site. Or you might actually be signed in to Facebook or you're on your Microsoft account or whatever. So the notion is that you can have multiple personas, and your persona's job is to map from the persona, which is something that you think about. I'm a Microsoft employee, or I'm a person, or I'm somebody, I'm sort of an ordinary individual, or I'm a porn browser, or whatever personas you consider to be suitable. And that your agent's job is to map the personas to the NIDs that are being used. So the agent keeps this persona map from personas to NIDs, and it can be as liberal as it wants in making up new NIDs. And hopefully that's going to address as much of the anonymity question as I know how to address. Final question, what about finding your data? In order to find your data, the essential problem is to figure out who's got it. Because you talk to lots of data handlers, and then data handlers talk to other data handlers, and so forth. So the answer is, strictly speaking in this scheme, you can't be sure who has your data, but you can be sure who's using it if they're following the rules, because they're not allowed to use it without consulting the policy service. And so the policy service's job is to keep track of all the handlers that have queried it. And that means that your agent can go and ask the policy service, who are all those handlers? And then, having done that, you can do the data claiming thing, just like we saw before. A strange thing happened when we were working all this out over the course of about 18 months. We had worked out a fairly elaborate centralized scheme for keeping track of who the handlers were for everyone's data. And we didn't like that very much because we didn't want to have a centralized scheme. And we worked very hard to make the centralized thing as anonymous as possible. And it wasn't until about a year into it that we realized that it was completely unnecessary to have a centralized scheme because by necessity, the policy service has all the necessary information. And why it took half a dozen smart people a year to figure this out is a question that I definitely don't know the answer to. Okay, what might be wrong with this scheme? Well, there's one very fundamental thing that's wrong with it, which is that there's a fundamental tension between control and privacy. If you're going to have control over the way your data is being used, you can be coerced. Tracking handlers is useful, but it's vulnerable. It's like browsing history. You can be coerced into disclosing your browsing history too. And that coercion can happen in a variety of ways. Law enforcement might be able to do it, or it might be a result of personal relationship. Parents can coerce their kids, spouses can coerce each other, employers can often coerce you, and so on and so forth. I don't know any general solution to this except plausible deniability. But it seems important to recognize that this is a pretty fundamental conflict. What about the policy? I've talked about it some, but I just wanted to summarize the essential points. The most important thing is the policy is data-centric. The tag stays with the data. It doesn't go with the handler or the service or the device or anything else. There has to be a really simple interface to policy because otherwise wide deployment is not going to be possible. So the interface I chose was the policy service's job is to say, this handler, this type of data, yes or no. It would be okay to pass more for the handler to pass more information about what it wants to do and maybe get back a richer result. But that can't be the base case because it'll be too complicated. In my view, if you're going to have wide deployment, you have to have a simple standard policy language. There can be maybe 7 plus or minus 2 different types of data: contacts, location information, transaction information. You choose the 7, but you can't have 50 because it's too complicated. It would be perfectly okay to extend one of these 7 types with a tree of subtypes, which will be ignored if they're not understood. And you have to recognize that most of the time they're going to be ignored. And what sort of language can you use for expressing the policy? Well, the basic policy is the one I said. Handler H may or may not use data type T. And then you can obviously compose such policies with ands and ors and elses. And if you want to have a complicated policy, like the one about the phone number for the school, the correct way to do it, in my view, is to encode the complicated policy in an app and treat the app as a handler and make sure that the app tags its output appropriately. And then you have to figure out whether you're willing to trust that app. User experience. This is the thing that I know the least about. I didn't mention we actually built a prototype of this thing, not a prototype in the sense that we actually deployed it and tried to get people to use it, but a prototype in the sense that we built all the moving parts so we could make sure we hadn't forgotten anything important. And it was only in the course of building the prototype that we figured out that you didn't need the centralized database, so that was weird. So we did not really work on the user experience question. I already said what I think are the most important thing about the user experience is that it should fit on one screen. Almost equally important, I think, is for this to work, almost certainly what that screen is going to say is, my policy is whatever Consumer Reports thinks is a prudent policy for ordinary people, with the following 3 exceptions. Because most people are not going to have the patience even to fill out the one screen. And obviously you need some kind of reasonable default to protect the normal carefree user. Yes?
Are you imagining that this moment happens rarely and then for many things, or all the time? So I can imagine like telling my phone, like, I want location to be held private, or I want location not held private, and then many moments where location is captured as
yes.
But then when you talk about certain transactions, do you say, like, I'm about to have a transaction. I'm buying this from Amazon. Do I want that data this way?
No, nobody's
going
to do that.
So then you're just saying like all commercial transactions.
Yeah, in practice, I think it would be fine to have a scheme that allows you to express more refined things, but nobody's going to actually use it. So I don't think it's really that important. I mean, it may be very important from the point of PR for geeks and civil liberties crazies, but from the point of view of what actually happens to a random person that you pick off the street, it's not going to matter, because nobody's going to have the patience to do that kind of thing. So the flip side of that is the basic structure has to have the property that you get an acceptable result following something similar to the story that I've been telling you, because that's the story that most people are going to be following. And so if you think that's going to give a really bad result, then you're not going to like the whole scheme.
Going back to what handlers are, am I even going to recognize a handler? You know, Google gets my data. I see that, you know, I say, yes, I want Google to be able to access it. If they give my data to some third party I've never heard of, am I just going to, you know, Consumer Reports template is going to blacklist, you know, it's going to have a white list of companies that are okay, and then all these other unknown companies are not? Or how am I going to recognize which handlers
how is Consumer Reports going to decide this? Yeah. That's a good question. Well, I'm not going to decide it because I don't have the patience for that. I'm going to do whatever Consumer Reports says is good, or you know, maybe what the ACLU says is good, or what Google says is good, or who knows. But I'm not going to be making those decisions typically because it's too hard.
But it sounded like earlier you were saying that in this scenario, if I agreed that Google could have a certain kind of information and they want to sell it to someone else, they can. It just has to carry that rule. Or is there
it carries the tag.
Right.
They have to ask, okay, here I'm a different handler. Right. I want access to this kind of data from this identity. Is it okay? So just because it was okay for Google to use it does not mean that it's okay for DoubleClick to use it.
But
that's a different question.
Categories about use, yes or no, but you could say categories of handlers.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
You could say search engines as opposed to marketers.
Absolutely.
Just understand in practice how this would happen. So I had a blood test today. I go to the doctor. At some point, I'm going to give them the right to look at my blood test results. Or can they help me access my own service, or do I need to go to my service and say, okay, I trust this doctor? You see what I mean? Can I give the doctor the right to? How in practice, how would I do it?
I don't know. Okay. There are many fascinating questions about what the user experience ought to be that we have not explored. And this is the biggest unknown, is what you can actually make a user experience that could actually work, as opposed to one where everyone just pushes OK all the time.
Right.
And I don't know the answer to that question. And I don't know any way to find out except to try it. A few details before I wrap up. The scheme has to provide some way to change your policy service, because policy services are bound to come and go, and there's the basic notion is it's kind of obvious the old one is going to forward queries that you make to the new one, and as long as you can figure out how to put something at the end of the URL that's been widely distributed in the tags, that'll be okay. And you might want some optional key escrow system. Some aspects of this need to be secured, and I believe it's the case that to first approximation, there's no special requirements today. You can secure all the conversations just using TLS. As I mentioned before, I think the right way to control complex uses of data is through apps, treating the app as a handler and controlling its access to the data and making sure that it tags its outputs appropriately. There's a big aspect of the user experience that we haven't thought about at all, is what the user experience should be for personas. And the fundamental problem with personas always is, are you using the right persona? And so it's very much up for grabs. Some things are kind of obvious. If you're the default, if you're sitting at your desk and at your employer, is that you should be using the work persona, but you probably don't want to be using the porn persona inappropriately, and so on and so forth. And I don't know what the answer to that is. Maybe that's such a hard problem that other than work and home personas are not actually going to work.
You've talked about making things super simple for the end user.
Yeah.
It seems to me, I'm just thinking about the whole thing with Pokemon Go, where the iOS app, when you downloaded it, gave permissions to access your entire Google account, which includes access to all your mail and stuff like that. But then they announced yesterday, oh, we're changing that. That was a mistake. We didn't mean to seek that many permissions. So there's two ways to read that. One is they're lying through their teeth. Of course they wanted that stuff, and then they got busted, so they're backtracking. But the other is
never ascribe to malice what can be explained by muddle.
Exactly. So how does this get made super clear to the app developers? Do they get one page also?
The basic story is there's only 7 types of data, and the rule is simple. They're supposed to follow the URL, say, here I am, here's my identity as a handler, and here's the type of data. Is it okay or not?
No, but the people who are writing the app.
Which app?
The app that is your, the app is your data handler? How does the...
You mean the app that's your agent?
No, you just mean any app.
No, a minute ago you had a slide up where the app is the...
Your policy.
Oh, that app. Those apps have to be written with considerable amount of care.
Right,
and I'm
how
sure
do those app developers learn how
there'll be a lot of screw-ups. There's a lot of screw-ups everywhere. I don't have any magic. I mean, no, really.
Well, no, I mean,
all
I'm really trying to highlight is that there's the problem of making it simple to the end user.
No, those things are not going to be simple. Those aggregation apps, that's not going to be so simple. That's going to be hard.
Okay.
Absolutely.
But developers already have to sort of do that. Like on your iPhone, if it wants to access your location, they have to ask. You have to approve it first. Like this app wants to use your location.
No. What Nancy means is if you're going to write an aggregating app, how do you know that it's actually doing aggregating properly as opposed to disclosing all kinds of stuff by mistake?
Yeah.
That's a very good question.
The permissions that the apps don't actually ask your permission for, even those kinds.
What do you do about data that is about me but I didn't help generate? So there's the blood test example where I'm sitting with a doctor and I can say, please classify this as health data. My health data is protected. What about sort of like traces of me moving through public space or transactions where I'm not there for? So is that data of and about me? Do I have a moment to be able to identify it?
My view, which is probably hopelessly naive, is that if you just take a picture, you can't say that it has to be tagged because there's no way to know what tag to put on it. But as soon as you've attached that picture to some person's identity, then you have to put the tag on it. And as I say, that's probably hopelessly naive, but it covers the most obvious cases. Let me press on a little bit, and then we'll have some time for questions at the end. A few refinements. We've talked about this first one. It's going to be, there are many, many situations in which you want to be able to aggregate data for purposes of research or for other things. For example, if you want to collect large amounts of speech data for training a speech recognition engine. And there's going to have to be some process which is not going to be primarily technical for certifying applications that do enough aggregation that it's okay for them to take the tags off. An extremely complex question that I only know the tiniest little bit about is the question of joint rights. If somebody takes a picture, presumably the photographer has some rights in it, the subject has some rights in it. How does that all play out? The naive way is to say, pile on as many tags as possible, and they all have to agree. And then the legal system and the political system can work out to what extent should that be relaxed. For example, different personas for personal and enterprise. This is a case in which it might well be true that the enterprise gets to manage your enterprise persona as opposed to you getting to manage it. Multiple policy services. You could certainly have multiple policy services because your agent gets to decide when it hands over the data which policy service to put in the URL. you can certainly imagine a fairly straightforward scheme along the lines of what's done in HTML for extending both policies and data types by essentially tacking on some subtree of subtypes and subpermissions, which would, as I mentioned before, have to have the property that if you didn't understand the subtree, you're free to ignore it, because otherwise deployment will become impossible. By extending the tag a little bit, you could make it so that this scheme can also be used to track the provenance of data, basically by logging every action. And by action, I mean data gets moved from one handler to another, or data gets passed through some computation. You could log every action and attach a log pointer to the tag, and then you could go back to the log and find out exactly how that data got to be where it was. Whether that's a good thing or not, I don't know, but it would be pretty straightforward technically. Okay, so to sum it all up, then people can ask more questions. In my view, we're going to have more regulation of one kind or another. And in the absence of some carefully thought out proposal with sound technical foundations, we're going to have what I view as kind of random regulation, like the right to be forgotten. So what I aspire to is a form of practical personal control where you can actually find your data, limit its use, claim it, and it works consistently across the whole internet, and it doesn't compromise anonymity if you care about that. The basic notion for doing it is the data should carry tags with it, and the fundamental job of the tag is to link to the policy that controls the use of the data. You can use personas to make it practical to have anonymous identities, and there isn't any necessity for any kind of centralized database. And that is the end of my story, and I'd be happy to answer more questions. And maybe some of the people in the audience will be motivated to work on some of these problems. Or transmogrify this into some other, much more wonderful scheme. Greg?
So I feel like I might be asking one of Bobby's questions a long way back and forth, but so it seems like when the job of attaching, so there's somebody who produces data which combines an identity and some data that attaches to it, and at that point they add a tag. And it seems like, I may not have I might not have much incentive to do this, right? Because once I add the tag, I then that data gets followed around, and I now have to follow the policy. So I'm wondering if there's any way that as a user or somebody acting on my behalf can get into the business of saying, your data is out there. It doesn't appear to have any provenance, but from now on it should be tagged. So could there be a notion of retrospective tagging that?
How would you find it?
Well, so how you find it seems like a hard problem. I agree.
The whole point of the tag is to make it possible to find it. Or one of the points.
Well, I mean, so yes, I'm thinking naively of, I see myself I see that I've been identified in a photo somewhere. I can check that it's not tagged because I'm supposed to have a list of everything that has tags. So now I've somehow found it.
Then I get to complain.
Then I get to complain, yeah. So when I get to complain, or when some agent looking on the web on my behalf gets to complain for me, could we then at that point add a tag or do something kind of?
Well, if the data handler is willing to respond to the complaint, yes, absolutely.
At that point, so I guess you could. Maybe some of the incentives could be moved to people acting on your behalf rather than all being pushed over to the other side. Good.
And presumably the data handlers have some incentive to make this work because the regulators are going to be mad at them if they're not playing straight. How powerful those incentives are, that's entirely up for grabs. Yeah.
Presuming, like you said, that most people won't really read the web page or whatnot, or they'll just pick the same sort of suggested standard for all of their data handlers. Why wouldn't we just make that the standard for all apps? And
because nobody,
be able to customize
you'd never be able to get agreement about what that standard ought to be. Whereas it's, Consumer Reports doesn't need anyone's agreement to make up their idea about what's the right thing. Then the only question is how many people like it. But you can't. Random tiny example illustrates this. You may not know this, but inside your browser there is a list of authorities that are trusted basically to tell the browser what Amazon's public key is. And there's about 200 of them. So of course it's wildly insecure because many of those have been horribly compromised, because 200 of anything, many of them are going to be horribly compromised, right? And random subexample, well, one of those authorities is the government of Korea, and the government of Korea decided that every public school in Korea should have delegated authority to do this. So every public school in Korea can write a certificate that identifies Amazon. Is this good? No, it's nonsense. Why do we have this? But it's for politics, because you couldn't get any agreement about what that set of authorities ought to be. So widespread agreement on these policy-related matters is hopeless. You can't have that.
So then how do you inform the average person of what to...
They choose Consumer Reports, or they take it by default from Google if they're using Chrome or whatever. But they have a reasonable decision that they make. It's easier than deciding what kind of car to buy. At least that's what I claim. Yes.
So maybe this is a hopeless desire for law to make sense, but but like a lot of this relies on the legal and regulatory system.
Yes.
So is there any sort of thing you can specify about like what are the minimum requirements of this regulatory system, or
yeah,
what kind of laws are totally useless?
The regulatory system's job is to punish data handlers that don't play by these simple rules.
Okay, but I mean,
the rules are pretty simple.
Well, I mean, it seems like there's lots of complexities. Like, so what if I hand off the data to someone who I know won't play by the rules, in hopes that they'll do something bad for me?
Yeah.
And then I get it back. Like,
yeah. Well, that's in the nature of law to be like that. There's lots of hard cases, and in the words of some Supreme Court justice, hard cases make bad law. What can you do? This is real life. There's not a magic technical fix. Yes.
Yeah, so I think one feature of the system is that you can claim your data by just giving your NID to a service and it'll return back the data. How do you protect that from leakage? So even if you encrypt the data, you're coming back by, say, encrypting it with your NID as a public key. So you need your own private key to decrypt it, right? I can still tell whether a system has data about you or how much data it has. So if I somehow find out one of your NIDs and then I query Ashley Madison or the Supreme Court or some state court for it, and I just get some gibberish that already reveals some information.
If you find out my NID,
one of them, yeah.
When I make one of those queries, the reason the NID is a public key is because one of those queries has to be authenticated by the corresponding private key. And if your private keys are compromised, then you're in the soup.
No, even sorry. So how would that work again? So you can't just.
If I go to a handler and say, give me back all the data for this NID, that request has to be signed by by that key.
Okay.
I didn't actually say that, but yeah, clearly you want that.
Who runs the policy services, or
you get to choose.
Okay, but what prevents a policy service from colluding with the data handler?
Nothing. I mean, that would be illegal, but technically nothing. If you maybe you should have chosen a different one.
Right. So are you imagining I install some software on some computer at my house and that's the
No. I imagine
big companies?
I imagine that companies will go into business doing it. Whether they're going to be big companies or little ones like GoDaddy, I don't know.
Google could, in theory,
oh, absolutely, and probably
their own policy service
absolutely
allow themselves to access.
And that would probably be a very good choice for most people. Google has a lot of incentives not to do that kind of collusion, right? But that's the reason why you don't want to try to standardize that kind of thing. You've asked lots of questions. Yes.
What does it look like when there's spam in this system that's just creating tons of data about me, and I don't
and overwhelming my policy, overwhelming my policy service with queries?
Yeah, and it's not till many moons later that I find out that there is a ton of data that says that I was in Nebraska all last year and doing different things, and it's not affecting me financially in the short term, but...
You mean just because there was all this crap and I didn't have the energy to paw through it?
Yeah, it might have been to someone else's benefit to create a lot of traffic that suggested something was
happening. Yeah, well...
They used tags from that I had circulated voluntarily
that's an interesting question. My immediate answer would be to say that I think that should probably be illegal. But is that going to prevent it from happening? No. Can we prevent spam completely? No. Sorry.
That's true.
I absolutely do not claim that a scheme like this is going to solve all the world's problems. I don't believe that any scheme can possibly solve all the world's problems in this space. Yes?
Are you concerned at all that if it's easier for me to find all of the data about myself, then it's also easy for somebody else to do the same? Right? You're doing half the work of...
Well, you can only do that if you have the public keys that correspond to those identities.
That's right, but maybe I'm safer with all of my information dispersed as it currently is, as opposed to having this identification process that I could maybe give to somebody else or somebody else to take this and that.
Well, you could make, what's the right way to think about that?
Well, here's another concern. So maybe in the future, Microsoft will be able to ask me for information that I currently don't have, but that I would have under your tagging mechanism. Right, so there's a lot of information about me that's out there right now that I can't somehow deliver to Microsoft before being hired because I don't know where it is, I don't know how to get it.
Yeah, this is an aspect of the coercion problem. And I agree, the coercion problem is very fundamental. I don't know how to do any better than I described to protect you against that kind of thing. I mean, yeah, if you're in the digital world, if your personal agent that holds the digital information that identifies you is compromised, you're in the soup. You know, your bank account can be drained and all kinds of other bad things can happen. This seems like a small problem compared to those things. But yes, it's serious.
Okay, one last question.
If my brokerage account password is compromised, people can go in there and sell all my stocks and do really bad things to me. What are you going to do? I'm open to suggestions. This doesn't make it any worse. One more question? Not from one of you guys. Who hasn't asked a question yet? Yes.
So for data that might be about multiple people in some way, like a group picture that someone takes a picture of everyone in this room, and I get to it first and I say this is data about me.
No, this is joint rights. Everyone has rights.
If I tag it, it's an untagged photo. I happen to see it first and tag it as a photo of me and say no one else in the world has access to this without specifically coming to me and asking for permission to see it. How does anyone else then find out that they're even in this photo?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know. Joint rights is a very, very confusing subject. I don't know. Needs research.
Thanks so much.